and welcome to the third video in my series of tutorials to create Alma, this spiky granny stitch blanket. In the first two videos, I talked about an introduction to the blanket, the yarn, the hook, everything like that you'll need, followed by the first row, the foundation stitch. So if you missed either of those, there's a link to those below and you can go back and watch them now. In this video, the third video, we're going to move on to the main spiky granny stitch section of the blanket, and we're going to show you how to work up this part of the pattern. Before we dive into the instructions, just a reminder that in these videos I'm using UK crochet terms, so I'll be referring to treble crochet and spiked treble crochet stitches in this video, and these are equivalent to double crochet or spiked double crochet stitches in US terms. One final thing before we get started is please note that there's a free written pattern for the complete blanket containing all the details that you'll need to make the blanket on my website. It's available in both US and UK crochet terms, so you can use whichever version you prefer. There's a link in the description below to the pattern, and I really recommend you go and get your copy now because you can follow along as you crochet the rows and tick them off as you create each row. So with our row of foundation treble crochet stitches complete for row 1, we need to turn over and get ready for row 2. So just turn your work over and we're ready to work row 2. Now from this point onwards, each row is going to start with 3 chains, and in every case that will count as your first stitch of the row, so 1 treble crochet stitch. Remember, in these tutorials I'm using UK crochet terms, where a treble crochet in UK terms is equivalent to a double crochet stitch in US terms. So we start with 3 chains to make the first stitch, 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to make 1 more treble crochet in the same stitch, so in the top of the last foundation treble crochet stitch of that first row. So insert your hook into the top of that stitch and work 1 treble crochet stitch. Then we're going to skip the next 2 stitches, 1, 2, and into that third stitch here we're going to work 3 treble crochet stitches all into that same stitch. So yarn over, insert your hook into the third stitch, skip 2, insert your hook into the next one, yarn over and pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through 2 loops, yarn over and pull through 2 more loops, and you'll need to repeat that 2 more times, all into the same stitch. So we'll have a little cluster of 3 treble crochet stitches. If you've made a granny stitch blanket in rows before, then you'll notice that this row is exactly the same as what you do in that blanket. We haven't got any spike stitches in this row yet. They're going to come in the next row. So we just keep repeating this all the way along row 1, skipping 2 stitches and then crocheting 3 treble crochet stitches into the next stitch, all the way along row 1 until we get to the final stitch. So I'm gonna keep working all the way along, skipping 2 stitches and then crocheting 3 stitches, 3 treble crochet stitches into the next stitch until I get to the end of the row. Skip 2, put 3 stitches into the next stitch, and keep going all the way along. Now when you get to the last 3 stitches of the row, which will be the first 2 proper foundation treble crochets from your previous row plus that chain 3, we're going to skip the next 2 stitches and then work 2, just 2 this time, treble crochet stitches into the top of that chain 3 from the start of row 1. So yarn over, insert your hook under the 2 loops, 2 strands at the top of that chain, yarn over and pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2 loops, yarn over, pull through 2 loops, then repeat that one more time to make a second treble crochet stitch to complete the row. And if we just have a look at that, you'll see we start and end the row with 2 treble crochet stitches. So we've got a chain 3 and a treble crochet in the first stitch and 2 treble crochets in the last stitch, and then the rest of the row we just skip 2 stitches, 3 treble crochet into the next stitch, skip 2 stitches, 3 treble crochet into the next stitch, and so on all the way along until you reach the end of row 2. Now we're going to change colour for the next row. So at the end of row 2 we're going to fasten off with yarn 8. So just snip your yarn and pop the tail through the loop that was on your hook and pull it tight to fasten off. Then turn your work over and grab yarn B, ready to start row 3. So here's yarn B, and to join it on, we need to join it onto the last stitch of the previous row, which will be where we start. So just insert your hook through the top of that last treble crochet, pop yarn B over your hook and pull that loop through. Then we start the row by chaining 3. As I mentioned, this is how we're going to start every row, and it counts as 1 treble. Then for the rest of the row, until we get to the end, we're going to be working in these spaces between the clusters. So we're going to work first in the space between the 2 trebles and the next 3 trebles, and then in all of the spaces between the clusters until we reach the end of the row. So firstly, into this first space, we work 1 treble crochet. So when I say work into the space, all you're going to do is simply insert your hook literally through that space. So for a treble crochet, we yarn over, insert our hook through that space, yarn over and pull up a loop. So we've got 3 loops, then yarn over and pull through 2 loops, and yarn over and pull through 2 loops. So that's just a normal treble crochet. Next, we're going to work our first spiked treble crochet stitch. So to do this, we yarn over like a normal treble crochet, but a spiked treble crochet means that instead of working it into the top of the previous row or this space, we're going to be missing this previous row and working into 1 row below that. So in this case, row 1. And here, as you remember, we skipped 2 stitches in row 1. So insert your hook into the top of the second stitch in the direction that you're working, the second skip stitch, yarn over. Your yarn's going to be going down the back of your work when you yarn over, and pull up a loop. And so that your work doesn't get too tight, this loop is going to be taller than normal. So you need to allow that loop to get a bit bigger than normal to pull it up to the height of the work where you're working, up to the height of the row where you're working. Then you just complete your treble crochet as normal. So yarn over, pull through 2 loops, yarn over and pull through 2 loops. And then we're going to make into this gap between the clusters, we're going to make 1 more treble crochet to complete the cluster, like that. So that's our first spiked granny cluster made. So we made 1 treble crochet into the space, a spiked treble crochet into the top of the second skip stitch, and then another treble crochet into the space. And the only difference for the spiked treble crochet is that it's worked 2 rows below, and as a result we have to pull up that first loop a bit taller than normal so that the top of the stitch is in line with the rest of the stitches in this row and it doesn't get pulled down. So I'll just pop my hook back in the loop and show you that again. So we're going to keep doing the same pattern all the way along the row. So working into the next space between the next 2 groups of clusters, we're going to make a treble crochet into that space. Then we're going to work a spiked treble crochet into the second skipped stitch in the direction that you're working. So yarn over, insert your hook into that skipped stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop. And remember, this loop needs to be pulled up taller than you normally would for a treble crochet, and then complete it as normal. So yarn over and pull through 2 loops, yarn over and pull through 2 loops, then work 1 more normal treble crochet into this same space between the clusters. And that's our next cluster, our next spiked granny cluster made. And we'll keep going all the way along the row. So into the next gap we do a treble crochet, a spiked treble crochet into the second skipped stitch, remembering to pull up that loop nice and long, and complete the treble crochet as normal, and another treble crochet into that gap. And I'll keep going all the way along this row, working the same pattern of 3 stitches into each space, and I'll meet you again at the end of this row. So I'm getting near the end of the row now. I'm just going to work my last cluster of treble, spike, treble, treble into this last space between the 3 trebles and the 2 trebles there. So we work a full cluster into this gap. So a treble crochet, a spike treble crochet, and another treble crochet. And then if you remember, we started the row with 3 chains for 1 treble, and we're going to end the row in the same way. All our rows are essentially symmetrical for this pattern. So we're going to end the row by working 1 treble crochet into the top of the chain 3 that started the previous row. So just into that 3rd chain stitch under those 2 strands there to complete the row. And that's row 3 complete. Row 4 is going to be made with the same yarn B, so no need to fasten off, but just turn your work around, ready to start row 4. So row 4 starts with 3 chains, 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to work a treble crochet into the space between that first or that last stitch and that first full spiked granny cluster. So yarn over, insert your hook into that space and make a treble crochet. And then we're going to work a spiked granny cluster into the space between all of these spiked granny clusters from the previous row. So we're going to yarn over, insert our hook into the space between the next 2 spiked granny clusters, yarn over and pull through 2 loops, yarn over and pull through 2 loops to make a treble crochet. And then we make a spiked treble crochet into the top of the central treble crochet from that cluster 2 rows below. Remember to pull up a slightly taller loop than normal to make your spiked treble crochet. Then we work 1 more treble crochet into that same space. And then into the next space we'll do the same. We work a treble crochet, and then a spiked treble crochet into that central treble crochet from 2 rows below, pulling up a taller loop than usual, and another treble crochet. And we'll keep going all the way along until we get to that end of the row. So we're getting to the end of row 4 now. I've worked my last spike granny cluster between these 2 full granny clusters, and then to finish the row off I'm going to work a treble crochet in the space between the spiked cluster and that chain 3 at the start of the row, like that, and then I'm going to work 1 treble crochet into the top of the chain 3 that started that previous row. And then we're going to change colour at the end of this row, so you can cut your yarn, which I've actually already done in this case, and fasten off just by pulling the tail through the loop that was on your hook. then turn your work over, ready to start row 5. So for row 5, we're going to be introducing our next colour, yarn C. So just pop your hook through the top of that last stitch of the previous row, pop the yarn over your hook and pull through, and then we'll start the row as normal by chaining 3 to make our first treble crochet. And then we're not going to work any more stitches into that first stitch, but we're going to work into this space between the 2 treble cluster and the spiked granny cluster. We're going to work a spiked granny cluster into this space. So we do a treble crochet, a spiked treble crochet into the top of the spiked treble crochet from 2 rows below, pulling up a slightly taller loop than usual, and another treble crochet into that same space. Then we just continue along the row, working spiked granny clusters over treble and a spiked treble into the top of the spiked treble from 2 rows below, and another treble into each space all the way along until we get to the end of the row. So I'm getting near the end of the row now. I've worked my spiked granny clusters into the space between all of the spiked granny clusters of the row below. I'm also going to work a spiked granny cluster into this last space between the spiked granny cluster and these 2 treble stitches. So I'll do a treble crochet, a spiked treble crochet into the top of that treble spiked one from 2 rows below, and then another treble crochet. And then we skip, just getting a bit more yarn, we skip this next treble crochet stitch and we work 1 treble crochet into the top of that chain 3 that started the row. So pop your hook through that 3rd chain from that chain 3 to complete the row, and we're going to make the next row with yarn C as well. So leave it on your hook, turn your work over, ready to start row 6. So from this point onward, we're simply repeating the last 2 rows again and again. So for row 6, we're going to just repeat row 4. The only difference is going to be when we change colour. Sometimes we're going to use a colour for 2 rows, sometimes just for 1 row, and sometimes for 3 rows. So as long as you know the stitch pattern, you just need to keep repeating the same 2 rows over and over again and change colour at the appropriate points. So for row 6, we start with 3 chains, and then as we did in row 4, we're going to make a treble crochet into that space between the treble and the first cluster, and then we're going to work spiked granny clusters all the way along to the end of the row, where the spike stitches are made into the top of the spike stitches from 2 rows below. And as you should be starting to see by now, these spike stitches are filling up the holes between the clusters, so that this blanket, compared to a normal striped granny stitch blanket, this blanket has much smaller gaps in it, and the spike stitches also give it a lot more texture and make it extra snuggly and cozy. So I'm going to keep going and meet you again at the end of row 6. I've just worked my last spiked granny cluster, and then to finish off the row I'm going to do the same as I did in row 4. I work a treble crochet into the space between the chain 3 and the first cluster, and then I work another treble crochet into the top of that chain 3. You might need to squidge the treble crochet over a bit so that you can find the top of that chain properly, and then work 1 treble crochet into the top of that chain. Then we're going to change colour to our fourth colour for the next row. So fasten off yarn C and turn your work over, ready to start row 7. So for row 7, we're going to join yarn D to the top of that last stitch of the previous row. So insert your hook into the top of the stitch, pop the yarn over your hook and pull up a loop. And then this is just going to be a repeat of row 5. So we chain 3, oops, and then we work a spiked granny cluster into each space all the way along, including that first space between the 2 trebles and the first spiked granny cluster. So we do treble crochet, just got my tail there, and a spiked treble crochet, and oops, a treble crochet, and the same all the way along. So I'm going to keep going and then meet you at the end of row 7. So I'm getting towards the end of row 7 now, and I'm going to finish it off as I did 2 rows below in row 5. So we do another spiked granny cluster in this space here between the spiked granny cluster and the 2 trebles. So we do a treble, a spiked treble, and another treble, and then we finish the row by making one last treble crochet into the top of that chain 3. We skip the next treble and make a treble crochet into the top of that chain 3 to complete the row. And we're just working a single row with yarn D this time. So at the end of row 7, we fasten off our yarn D and turn our work over, ready for row 8. For row 8, we're going to go back to yarn C. So we join that to the top of the last stitch of the previous row, and we're going to work 2 rows with yarn C. So row 8 is a repeat of row 4. So we start with a chain 3, and then we work 1 treble crochet into that space between the last stitch and the first cluster. Remember, just look 2 rows below and see what you did there. So the rows alternate between starting with a single treble and 2 trebles each time before the first full cluster. So for this row, we work another treble crochet into that first space. Just move my end out of the way, and then we're going to go all the way along, working a treble and a spike treble and a treble into each space until we get to the end of the row. So I'm getting to the end of row 8 now, so I'm going to finish the row with a treble crochet in that last space between the full spiked granny cluster and that chain 3, and then another treble crochet into the top of that chain 3. Remember to squidge it along a bit if you need to find the top of that chain. And then we're going to keep going with yarn C for the next row. So don't fasten off, but turn your work over and continue for row 9. Row 9, as always for odd numbered rows, is a repeat of row 5. So we start with 3 chains, we skip the next treble crochet stitch, and we're going to work a spiked granny cluster into that next space. So we do work spiked granny clusters into all of the spaces all the way along until we get to the end of the row. So I'm just getting to the end of row 9 now. I've worked my last spiked granny cluster into that last space. Then I finish off the row by working a treble crochet into the top of the chain 3 that started the previous row. So I'll then have had 2 rows worked in yarn C, and I'm ready to fasten it off and change back to yarn B again for the next 2 rows. There we go, and turn over, ready to start the next row. So for row 10, we're going to join yarn B to the top of the last stitch of row 9 and chain 3, and this is going to be a repeat of row 4 because it's an even numbered row. So for all the even rows, we start with 2 treble crochets at the beginning, so the chain 3 counts as 1, and then we work a treble crochet into that first space, and then keep going along, working into the spaces between the spiked granny clusters, working new spiked granny clusters into each space until we get to the end of the row. So I'm reaching the end of row 10 now, so I'm going to work a treble crochet into that space between the last spiked granny cluster and the chain 3, and then move that along a bit so I can work another treble crochet into the top of that chain 3, and then we're going to continue with yarn B for the next row, row 11. So keep it on your hook, turn your work over and start row 11, which is obviously an odd row, so it's going to be a repeat of row 5. So we chain 3 and then just work our spiked granny cluster in all of the spaces all the way along, including that first space between the 2 trebles and the first full spiked granny cluster. So I'm getting to the end of row 11 now. I'm going to work one last spiked granny cluster into the last space, the space between the final spiked granny cluster and the 2 trebles at the start of the previous row, and then I'm going to work one last treble crochet into the top of this chain 3 at the start of the row, and then we're finished with yarn B again for now, so we can fasten off at this point. So by now you should be able to see that the pattern of the different colours and changing yarn after either 1 or 2 rows is building up this lovely pattern of colours, which I think looks a little bit like Fair Isle style knitting. So next, for row 12, we're going to go back to yarn A again. So turn your work over again, get yarn A and join it to the last stitch of the previous row, and we're going to work 3 rows this time, all in yarn A, starting with 3 chains, and then just get the tails out of the way, a treble crochet into that first space, and continuing along with our spiked granny clusters into all of the other spaces until we work that last space of the row. So I'm getting to the end of row 12 now. I finish it off with a treble crochet into the last space and another treble crochet into the top of the chain 3, and then I'm going to keep going with yarn A straight into the next row, and I'm going to work 2 more rows of the same stitch pattern with yarn A. So I've just worked 3 rows in yarn A, which takes me to the end of row 14, and I've fastened off because at this point we're going to switch back to yarns B, C and D to repeat this pattern, but we'll cycle through yarns B, C and D in a different order. So here we went B, C, D, C, B. Next time we're going to go D, B, C, B, D. So I've just cycled through yarns B, C and D again, this time going D, B, C, B, D, and I've worked another row in yarn A. So then I'd work 2 more rows in yarn A before cycling through yarns B, C and D in the final order. The final order would be C, D, B, D, C. So I'd have 3 different cycles through my 3 colours, and then I do that 3 times. So I'd end up with 9 of these bands of colour in total all the way up the blanket. Then after the final band, we'd have 1 row in yarn A like this before we make the final row of the main section of the blanket, which is also in yarn A. So after that single row in yarn A, we'd keep it on our hooks, turn over, and then we'd complete the main section of the blanket with 1 last row in yarn A of just treble crochets all the way along. So we chain 3 to make the first treble, which counts as the treble crochet in that first treble, the last treble of the previous row. Then we just make 1 treble crochet in each stitch, each further stitch, all the way along to the end of the row. Remember, in this row of treble crochets, we're working into the tops of the trebles and spiked trebles from the previous row. So we're not working in any of the spaces this time. Just make sure that your treble crochet stitches go into the top, 1 treble crochet into the top of each stitch from the previous row. Then when we get to the end of the row, we make 1 last treble crochet into the top of that chain 3, which started the previous row. And we're going to continue with yarn A to make the border. So you don't need to fasten off, but we'll continue with this yarn, keep it on our hook, ready to make the border. So that completes the main section of the blanket. As always, feel free to go back and watch this as many times as you need to make sure that it's clear for you. But once you get into the swing of it, you'll find it quite relaxing and easy to work because it's just a simple 2-row repeat where the start and end of the row is different each time, either starting with a single treble or 2 trebles together and changing colour as needed. As I mentioned before, there is a free written pattern available for this blanket on my website, and that sets out exactly how many rows to do in each colour and how to cycle through the different colour combinations. That's available on my website and there's a link for that below, so do go and check that out. It's also helpful because you can tick off the rows as you make them and keep track of your progress that way. When you've completed the main section of this blanket, if you haven't yet done so, you might want to sew in your ends at this point. Some people find they might get in the way when they're working around the blanket to make the border. On the other hand, if you'd rather do the border first and then sew them in, it's entirely up to you. Some people like to sew them in as they go, so they don't have them all to do at the end. Others prefer to blitz them all at the end of the blanket. One thing that is quite nice if you sew in the ends after you've done the border is that, especially with the yarn A, which will match the colour that we're using for the border, you can then weave it into the border instead of the main section of the blanket, which can be nice. It doesn't disrupt the stitches of the blanket so much. To weave it in the ends, I just go back and forth a few times on the wrong side of the work through the stitches of the same colour yarn that I'm weaving in. Some variations you might of course like to consider is using different colours for these bands, sections where I've used yarns B, C and D. For example, you could use more colours, you could cycle through them in different orders. I've used 3 different orders for my colours B, C and D, just cycling through them, but you can also flip a couple of them over and then you get 3 more combinations as well. So you can get quite creative with which colours and how you use them in these sections. You might want to just repeat 1 order throughout the whole blanket. That would be another option. You could also, if you wanted to, increase the spacing between the bands if you want to. I used 3 rows of yarn A. If you have an odd number of rows, then the points of your spikes will line up If you went for an even number, then they'd just be slightly shifted. So that's something to bear in mind when thinking about how many rows of yarn A to have between your bands of the pattern. But otherwise, have fun, experiment, and this is a really good way for finding new colour combinations and seeing which unexpected combinations might work well that you haven't thought of before. So I hope you found this tutorial useful and helpful, and you enjoy making the main section of your Spiky Granny Stitch blanket, the Alma blanket. And I will see you in the next video to show you how to add a lovely ribbed border using post stitches all the way around the edge of your blanket.